How many years have you spent being told that your time would come? Not a month and not a season, but years, long enough that the phrase has stopped meaning anything, and long enough that the people who used to say it to you have quietly stopped saying it. You have watched other people arrive. You have watched them announce the thing, receive the thing, and become the thing, while you remained in the same room, doing the same work, giving the same careful answer whenever someone asked how it was going. And somewhere inside that long stretch, a harder question began to form, which was not whether it would happen, but whether you had spent the only years you were given waiting for something that was never coming. According to Carl Jung, the most significant changes in a human life almost never announce themselves. They take place underneath the visible surface, in a region where nothing can be measured and nothing can be shown to anyone, long before a thing in the outer world begins to move. The person is quietly being rebuilt, while the calendar appears to be standing still. This is difficult to accept, because most of us have been taught to read stillness as failure, and to assume that if the situation has not changed, then nothing has happened. But there is a kind of work that can only be done in conditions where nothing is happening. It cannot be done in motion, and it cannot be done while you are being watched, or rewarded, or congratulated for it. It can only be done in the long, unlit stretch where no one is keeping score. In this video, we are going to look at those years again, not to make them beautiful, and not to pretend that every delay was secretly a gift, because some of them were not. We are going to look honestly at what was being built during the time you believed that nothing was being built. Stay with me until the end, because by the time we finish, you may discover that the question you have been asking all this time was slightly wrong. You have been asking when it will finally happen. The more honest question, and the one that changes everything, is who it will be happening to. Number 1. The years that looked empty were not empty. Let us begin with the part that hurts most, which is not the waiting itself, but the suspicion that the waiting meant nothing. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from effort without evidence. You are still working, still applying, still practicing, still showing up on the days when no part of you wants to, and yet nothing in the outer world confirms that any of it is landing. There is no reply, no offer, and no visible change. And after enough repetitions of this, something in you quietly begins to withdraw its investment. You do not stop trying, but you stop believing that trying is connected to anything. That is the moment when the years start to feel wasted. It is not the moment when the door closes, but the moment when you can no longer feel the difference between working and waiting. I know a Turkish woman named Elif who lives in Rotterdam, and for 9 years she translated technical manuals for a logistics company while waiting to be given a novel. She was good at the work, and her sample chapters were praised by editors who then never wrote to her again. Twice she was told that a contract was almost certain, and twice the imprint was restructured before anything was signed. She kept a folder on her desktop called Real Work, and every year that folder grew larger, and nothing inside it was ever published. She told me that the hardest part was never the rejection, but the Sunday evenings. She would sit at the kitchen table with the window open, listening to other people's dinners in the courtyard below. She felt the specific shame of being 34, and then 36, and then 38, with a folder of unpaid work and a job she could do without thinking. None of it was visible to her because it produced nothing she could show to anyone. 9 years of technical translation had made her precise in a way that almost no literary translator ever becomes. She had spent 9 years unable to hide behind a beautiful sentence. Every word had to carry an exact meaning, since a mistranslated safety instruction is not a stylistic problem. When she was finally given a novel, she translated it in 5 months, and the author asked for her by name for the next 2 books. The 9 years did not delay her career. The 9 years were the apprenticeship that no one would have designed for her, and that no one would ever have paid her to complete. Jung wrote that there is no birth of consciousness without pain. He did not mean that suffering is valuable in itself, and he was not offering a consolation prize to people who happened to be struggling. He meant something more precise and less comfortable, which is that a person does not acquire a new level of self-understanding through insight alone. It has to be paid for in lived time, usually under conditions that the person would never have chosen. The reason waiting feels so meaningless while we are inside it is that the change it produces cannot be observed from within. You cannot watch yourself becoming more patient, and you cannot feel your tolerance for uncertainty widening while it widens. These developments only reveal themselves later, in a situation that would have broken you a few years earlier and does not break you now. Consider what happens to a field that has been left fallow. Nothing is planted in it, and for an entire season it produces no crop, no income, and no evidence of anything, so that to a person walking past it looks like land that has been abandoned. But underneath the surface, nitrogen is returning to the soil, the structure of the earth is recovering from being worked, and the organisms that were exhausted by continuous production are quietly rebuilding themselves. The field is not resting from its work. The field is doing the one kind of work that cannot be done while it is producing. Human beings are the same. There are capacities in you that can only develop while you are not being measured, and they will not develop while you are performing. This does not mean that every empty year was productive, and it would be dishonest of me to suggest otherwise. Some of that time was lost, and some of it went to fear, to the wrong people, and to strategies that we already suspected were failing. You are allowed to name that plainly instead of converting all of it into meaning. But notice how easily we do the opposite. We take a period that contained both waste and formation, and because the formation was invisible, we file the entire thing under failure. We remember every month that produced nothing, and none of the changes that produced no receipt. So, the question worth sitting with is not whether those years produced results, but what those years produced in you that no result could ever have produced on its own. Because when we finally look back at the stretch that felt most pointless, we rarely find nothing there. We usually find the exact quality that made everything afterwards possible, formed in the dark, without applause, during a period we were busy calling a waste of our lives. Number 2. What was true in the morning is not true at evening. If the empty years were quietly building something, then the first thing they build is almost never a new direction. It is a growing discomfort with the old one. This is where many of us become confused about ourselves. We expected that clarity would arrive as excitement, as a sudden and unmistakable knowledge of what we were meant to do. Instead, it arrives as a strange flatness around the things that used to move us. The goal we have carried for a decade no longer produces any feeling when we picture it. The role we built our identity on now feels like a costume we put on every morning. Nothing outside has changed, but something inside has stopped agreeing. We tend to interpret this as losing our motivation, when it is sometimes the exact opposite. What is losing power is often not your ambition at all, but a version of your ambition that belonged to a person you are no longer being. Rainer Maria Rilke received a letter in 1903 from a 19-year-old officer cadet named Franz Kappus, who wanted to know whether his poems were any good. Rilke did not answer the question. He told the young man that nobody on earth could tell him that, and that asking anyone else to confirm it was already a mistake. He told him to go into himself and to find the reason that compelled him to write. The test was whether he would still write if forbidden from ever showing a word of it to anyone. Then he said, the thing that has outlived everything else in those letters. He told Kappus to be patient toward all that was unsolved in his heart. He asked him to love the questions themselves, like locked rooms and like books written in a foreign tongue. He told him not to search for the answers because they could not be given to him and because he would not yet be able to live them. The point was to live the questions now, so that perhaps, gradually, without ever noticing it, he would live his way into the answer on some distant day. What Rilke understood is that certain answers cannot be received early. They are not information, but the residue of having lived through a particular stretch of time. A person who receives them too early will not recognize what they are holding. Jung described this same transition in one of the most unsparing passages he ever wrote. He said that we cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning. What was great in the morning will be little at evening, and what in the morning was true will at evening have become a lie. Notice how severe that final word is. He does not say outdated, and he does not say less useful. He says a lie, which means that a truth outliving its season does not become irrelevant. It becomes actively false, and continuing to live by it places you in a false relationship with your own life. This is why the ending of an old chapter so rarely feels like relief, and so often feels like betrayal, because you are being asked to abandon something that was genuinely right. The ambition that carried you through your 20s was not a mistake, and the way of working that made you valuable was not a mistake either. Someone who spent 15 years becoming excellent at holding everything together is not wrong for having done it. But a truth with a season is still a truth with a season. The discomfort you feel is not evidence that you have lost your way, but evidence that the season has turned. Think about the scaffolding that goes up around a building under construction. While the structure is being raised, that scaffolding is essential. It carries the workers, holds the materials, and supports sections that cannot yet support themselves. There is nothing false about it, and nothing careless in how seriously it is built. But once the structure has set, the scaffolding becomes the only reason the building still looks unfinished, and leaving it up no longer protects anything. It prevents everyone, including the people living inside, from seeing what has already been completed. Many of us are still living inside scaffolding that came down years ago in every way except the one that counts. Someone who learned early that being useful was the safest way to be loved may go on being useful long after the danger has passed. Someone who survived an unstable childhood by predicting everybody's moods may still be scanning rooms that hold no threat at all. Someone who built an entire career proving they were not what their family expected may still be proving it to people who never met their family. None of these strategies were foolish, and each of them worked, which is precisely why they are so difficult for us to release. We do not cling to the things that failed us. We cling to the things that saved us, long after the emergency they were built for has quietly ended. And that is the more forgiving way to understand this flat, disloyal feeling you have been carrying for a while now. You have not become ungrateful for the life you built, and you have not lost your capacity to want things. You have simply arrived at the hour when the morning program stops working, and something in you was honest enough to notice it before you had anywhere else to go. Number 3. The pattern that kept closing the door. Once you can feel that the old program has expired, a more uncomfortable question tends to surface. If the waiting has been building something, and if you can already sense what no longer fits, then why has nothing changed? For some people, the honest answer is timing, and nothing more than timing. But for many of us, there is a second answer underneath it, and it is harder to look at directly. Some of those doors did open, and you were standing right there when they opened, and something in you closed them. Almost none of this is deliberate. We withdraw from the opportunity for a reason that sounds responsible at the time. We do not send the message, or we accept the smaller version of the offer, or we walk into the room and make ourselves slightly less impressive than we are. Afterwards, we explain it to ourselves with a reason so reasonable that we never examine it again. A viewer wrote to us last year describing something like this with unusual clarity. He said that at 31, he was given the role he had been working toward since he left university, with a better title, better money, and a team of his own. The first week, he said, felt like standing inside someone else's coat. By the second month, he was arriving late, and by the fourth month, he had resigned. He told everyone, including himself, that the culture had not been the right fit. He said it took him 6 more years to admit what had actually happened. He had spent his entire childhood being the one who did not need anything, in a house where needing things was expensive. Being handed something he badly wanted put him in a position he had no idea how to occupy. He did not leave that job because it was wrong for him. He left because being visibly given something he wanted was more frightening than never having it, and he had never once looked at that directly. Jung wrote that everyone carries a shadow, and that the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it becomes. He was not describing evil, and he was not describing the worst of a person. He was describing the parts of us that were never allowed to develop in the open, and which therefore go on operating without any supervision, from a place we cannot see. This is the mechanism that quietly turns a personal pattern into what feels like bad luck. When something in us is unexamined, it does not stop acting, but acts through our choices while presenting itself as our judgment. We do not experience it as fear. We experience it as an accurate assessment of the situation. Someone who has never looked at their fear of being seen will read a good opportunity as unrealistic. Someone who has never looked at their fear of depending on anyone will read a generous offer as a trap that has not sprung yet. Someone who has never looked at their belief that they are fundamentally too much will read a warm room as a room they ought to leave early. And because each of these readings arrives dressed as discernment instead of fear, it is almost impossible to argue with from the inside. Water behaves in much the same way. When a river has run through the same channel for long enough, it cuts a groove into the land, and after that, the groove does the deciding. You can send a fresh current down that valley for 100 years, and it will follow the old bed every time. That is not because it prefers the route, but because the route was carved long before the flow arrived. A new channel does not form when more volume arrives. It forms only when something obstructs the old one long enough that the water is forced to find another way through. Old psychological patterns work in exactly the same way. They do not require your agreement, and they will not be corrected by better intentions. Correction happens only when something interrupts the automatic path long enough for a different response to become possible, which gives the long waiting period a function that is very easy to miss. A closed door does not always mean that you were unwanted or overlooked. Sometimes it means that the groove was still doing the deciding, and that whatever opened would have run straight back down it. This is not a comfortable idea, and I am not going to soften it. Some of what we have been calling misfortune was participation. It was not fault, and it was not blame, because a pattern formed in childhood is not a moral failure on anyone's part. But it was participation, in the sense that we were present at the events that kept repeating. There is real relief in this, though it takes a moment to see where the relief is. If the obstacle were external, we would have no access to it. If the obstacle is partly a groove cut into us by circumstances we did not choose, then the groove can be found. Once it has been found, it stops running the whole operation. You do not need to eliminate the fear, since that is not available to anyone alive. What becomes available is the half-second between the fear and the decision, and that half-second is the entire difference between a life that repeats itself and a life that turns. Before we continue, sit with this honestly for a moment. Think of the last real opening you had, and ask yourself which perfectly reasonable explanation you gave yourself for stepping back from it. Not the situation, and not the timing, the explanation. Maybe you have spent years believing you had bad timing, and you are beginning to suspect that something older was steering. If so, write in the comments, "I choose to stop calling it lost time." Not because the years were painless, and not because you have finished with them, but because a person who can finally see the groove is no longer inside it. Number 4. The detour was the road. Once you can see the pattern, a new grief usually arrives, and it tends to be sharper than the first one. If some of this was mine, then I have lost years to it, and other people did not lose those years, and other people are ahead of me now. This is the comparison wound, and it does more quiet damage than almost anything else in a stalled life. It does not simply make you feel behind, because it also rewrites your past. Every year that produced no visible result becomes evidence in a case we are steadily building against ourselves, and the verdict never changes. You should be further along than this by now. But that sentence contains an assumption that almost nobody stops to examine. Further along what, exactly? A route you never chose, on a timetable you never agreed to, measured against people whose interiors you have not once been allowed to see. There is a story in Genesis that has been told so often that its most important feature is usually skipped over entirely. Joseph is 17 when he receives the dream that his family will one day bow to him. He is sold by his brothers, carried into Egypt, and sold a second time. He rises in the house of Potiphar through sheer competence, is falsely accused, and is thrown into prison. There he correctly interprets the dream of Pharaoh's cupbearer and asks only to be remembered when the man is restored. The cupbearer is restored, and the text records with devastating brevity that he forgot Joseph, and that he went on forgetting him for 2 full years. Those 2 years are the part of the story that matters here, not the pit, which was violent and mercifully fast, and not the throne, which came much later. What matters are the 2 years in which the one person who could have helped him never thought of him again. Joseph was 30 when he finally stood before Pharaoh, which means 13 years between the dream and its fulfillment, and the greater part of that time was not dramatic suffering. It was being forgotten by somebody who had promised to remember. Whatever you believe about the origin of that text, the psychological observation buried inside it is exact. The man who stood before Pharaoh and reorganized the food supply of an entire empire could not possibly have been the 17-year-old with the dream. The 17-year-old told his brothers about the dream, which is what a 17-year-old with a dream does. The 13 years did not delay the outcome. The 13 years produced the only person capable of surviving it. Jung wrote that the right way to wholeness is made up, unfortunately, of fateful detours and wrong turnings. The word he inserted into the middle of that sentence is the one that keeps the whole thing honest. Unfortunately, he is not claiming that the detours were pleasant, and he is not claiming that they were secretly efficient. He is saying that they were necessary and that they were unpleasant, and that both of those things are true at the same time. We badly want to be told either that the lost years were meaningless or that they were beautiful, and Jung refuses to give us either. He says that they were the road, and that the road went through places we would not have chosen. Think about what happens inside a kiln. Different clays vitrify at different temperatures, and the difference is not a matter of a few degrees. An earthenware body matures at around 1,000 degrees, while a stoneware body needs closer to 1,300. If you take stoneware out of the kiln at earthenware temperature, it will look finished, with shape and color, and every appearance of a completed object. But the particles will never have fused, and the first time it holds hot liquid it will fail, because it was removed at the temperature that finishes a different material entirely. 2 pieces can sit in the same kiln, in the same fire, and require entirely different amounts of it. The one that needs longer is not defective in any way. It is made of something that fuses at a higher temperature. Someone who arrived at stability early is not more capable than you are. Someone who found their direction at 23 is not carrying what you have been carrying. Someone who has never had to rebuild is not stronger for it, and they may not yet know what they are able to survive. Respecting your own timing does not mean lowering your standards, and it does not mean calling avoidance patience. You still have to act, still have to choose, and still have to move toward the thing while it remains uncertain. What changes is that you stop measuring the value of your progress against a body of clay that was never the same as yours. And when we stop doing that, the past quietly reorganizes itself. The years do not become beautiful, because some of them were not. But they stop being evidence against you, and they become the temperature you happen to require, in a kiln you did not build, for a material you never chose to be made of. Number 5. Learning to read your own fear correctly. Understanding that the detour was the road does not stop your body from reacting as though it was not, and that is the next thing worth being honest about. You can accept intellectually, that the years shaped you. You can accept that some of the closed doors protected you from things you were not ready to hold. And then a message arrives, or an opportunity surfaces, or someone offers you the thing you have been describing for a decade. Within about 4 seconds, your nervous system delivers a verdict. Too late, too risky, not for you. The verdict arrives before any thinking has taken place, which is precisely why it feels so much like the truth. This is the part of the work that almost nobody discusses, because there is nothing inspiring about it. Stability is not the state of no longer being afraid, and anyone selling that is selling something. Stability is the far less glamorous ability to receive a strong feeling and not immediately obey it. Marisol works in hospice care in San Antonio, where she has been for 11 years, and she is unusually good at it. For most of that time, she has also been quietly certain that she is not management material, so when the coordinator role opened, she did not apply. She told me that the reasoning felt airtight at the time. She was better with patients than with spreadsheets. The families needed her at the bedside, and she would only be leaving the actual work in order to attend meetings about the actual work. Every one of those statements was true, and that is what made them so convincing. What she noticed, about a week after the deadline had already passed, was that her chest had been tight for 4 days beforehand, and that she had rehearsed her reasons to 3 separate colleagues without any of them asking. She said the giveaway was never the argument itself. It was how hard she had been working to sell it. The following year, the role opened again. She was still afraid, and the tightness came back on schedule. But this time, she sat with it for 2 days before deciding anything. She said that what changed was not that the fear got smaller, because it did not. What changed was that she stopped treating the fear as information about the job and started treating it as information about herself. Jung wrote that the pendulum of the mind oscillates between sense and nonsense, not between right and wrong. It is a strange sentence until you have lived through it. He is pointing out that the swinging of the mind is not a moral instrument that reliably tells us what is good and what is bad. It is a mechanism that swings, and at either extreme it produces an overwhelming feeling of conviction. The conviction is the swing itself. It is not the verdict, which means that the confidence we feel in a reaction tells us almost nothing about whether that reaction is accurate. Certainty is a sensation rather than a proof, and the strongest certainty usually arrives at the moment the pendulum is furthest out. There is a reason our oldest fears feel so authoritative. A present rejection never arrives alone, because it arrives carrying every earlier rejection it happens to resemble, and the response we produce is calibrated to the entire stack, not to the thing in front of us. This is why the reaction so often looks disproportionate to everyone watching and feels proportionate to us. You are not responding to the email. You are responding to everything the email is standing in for. Consider how a keel works on a sailing boat. People assume that the keel exists to keep the boat upright, but it does not do that. A boat with a keel still leans, sometimes severely, and in a strong wind it will lean far enough to frighten anyone who has never sailed before. What the keel does is carry weight low enough in the water that the lean is unable to become a capsize. The boat is not prevented from tipping. The boat is given something that returns it. Inner stability is that, and nothing more heroic than that. You will still be knocked sideways by a rejection, by a silence, or by an old memory surfacing at an inconvenient hour. What changes is that the lean stops turning into a capsize, and the return happens in hours instead of months. So the practical work here is much smaller than people expect. It is not about becoming fearless, but about learning to name what has just arrived, accurately, in the moment that it arrives. This is a fear, and a fear is a prediction, not a report. This is an urge to withdraw, and an urge is a suggestion, not an instruction. This is an old memory being activated, and a memory is the past arriving in the present, not the present repeating itself. Say it plainly enough and something loosens. It is not that naming a feeling dissolves it, because it does not. but a named feeling can be held at arm's length long enough for a decision to be made beside it rather than by it. We should be honest that this does not work every time. Some fears are accurate, and some withdrawals are wisdom, and there are situations you should leave as quickly as you possibly can. The point is not to override ourselves in every case. The point is to build enough interior room that we can tell the difference at the time instead of discovering it 2 years later. And that room is the actual product of the waiting. It is not the patience, and it is not the humility, though both of those may also have arrived. It is the room. It is the distance between what you feel and what you do, which nobody else can see, which took years to build, and which will determine almost everything about what happens when the situation finally changes. Thank you for staying with me this far. Before we go on, stop the video for a few seconds and answer one question with real honesty. When was the last time you talked yourself out of something using an argument that was true? If you are willing, write that reason in the comments. Not the outcome and not the regret. The reason. There is something unusually clarifying about seeing it in your own words, outside your own head. Number 6. What you wanted changed while you were waiting. Here is the part that almost nobody prepares you for, and it is the reason so many people feel disoriented at the exact moment things finally begin to move. You have been waiting a long time for a specific thing. You have pictured it, argued for it, and defended it to people who thought you should be more realistic. And somewhere in the last few years, quietly and without any ceremony, the thing itself changed shape. What you want now is not identical to what you wanted then, and you may not have noticed the substitution, because it happened one small revision at a time. This produces a particular kind of confusion. You get close to the original goal and feel almost nothing, or you find yourself unaccountably drawn to a smaller, stranger, less impressive version of it. And because we have spent years defending the first version in public, we assume that the flatness means we are broken, or exhausted, or that we have finally given up. Usually it means something different. It means the desire was being refined during the entire period you believed it was simply being denied. In 1984, Ang Lee finished film school at New York University, where his thesis film won an award and agents were interested in him. And then, for roughly 6 years, nothing happened. He stayed at home in White Plains while his wife, a molecular biologist, supported the family on her salary. He cooked, he looked after their sons, and he wrote screenplays that nobody produced. He has spoken openly about how humiliating that period was in a culture where a man's worth was tied to providing. He has also described how close he came to abandoning film and enrolling in a computer course so that he could earn something. His wife told him not to do it. 2 of his screenplays won first and second prize in 1990 in a competition run by Taiwan's Government Information Office, and that led directly to his first feature film. Now look at what those early films are about. Pushing Hands, The Wedding Banquet, Eat, Drink, Man, Woman, kitchens and fathers and meals as the place where families say the things they cannot say to each other directly. Domestic Space, observed with a patience that only comes from having been inside it for years with almost nothing else to do. The 6 years did not interrupt his work. The 6 years wrote his work. The young man who left film school in 1984 would have made competent films about something else, because he did not have the material yet. That material was not available anywhere in a film school. It was available in a house in White Plains, on a series of ordinary afternoons, for 6 years, at a cost he never wanted to pay. Jung wrote that the sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being. It is an unusually direct claim from a man who rarely made them. He is not talking about achievement. He is talking about consciousness, and the purpose he names is not to acquire the thing at all. It is to become awake inside the life we are actually living, which is a completely different aim and cannot be reached by acquisition. Long waiting periods do something very specific to a desire, and it is extremely easy to misread as loss. They strip away the part of the wanting that was about being seen to want it. and what remains is smaller, quieter, and more accurate. Think about seawater left in a shallow pan in the sun. Over a few days, the volume drops steadily, and if you were measuring only volume, you would conclude that something was being destroyed. But the water was never the point of it. What is left at the bottom of the pan is salt, and that salt was in the water the entire time, in a concentration so low that you could not possibly see it. Nothing was added by the sun. Something was removed, and what remained was what had always been dissolved in there. Long waiting works on our wanting in exactly the same way. The volume goes down, and with it goes the urgency, the timeline, and the need for it to happen in front of particular people. What also goes is the version of it that was mostly about proving something to somebody who stopped paying attention years ago. All of that evaporates, and while it is evaporating, it feels precisely like the desire is dying. What is left in the pan is what you actually wanted. Someone who spent a decade wanting to be a respected writer may find that what remains is wanting to write one true thing. Someone who spent a decade wanting a relationship that would prove they were lovable may find that what remains is wanting to be known by one person. Someone who spent a decade wanting to run their own company may find that what remains is wanting to decide how their own days are spent. None of these are consolation prizes. They are the concentrate, and this is worth saying carefully, because it can be badly misused. Not every fading desire has been refined, and some were abandoned under pressure and should be picked back up. You are the only person who can tell the difference, and the test is not whether the wanting is loud. The test is whether the quiet version still moves you when nobody is watching you want it. So if the thing you are approaching now looks smaller than the thing you set out for, do not assume you have settled. Check the pan. You may not be looking at a reduced version of your ambition, but at the part of it that was real all along. Number 7. The door opens when you can hold what is behind it. We arrive now at the question underneath all of the others, and it is the one people avoid most carefully, because it moves the problem out of the world and into the self. It is not when will it come, and it is not why has it not come yet. It is this: if it arrived on Tuesday, in full, exactly as you have been describing it for years, what would happen inside you? Most of us have never asked this seriously, since we assume that receiving the thing will automatically produce the person capable of holding it. The offer will make us confident, the relationship will make us secure, and the money will make us calm, and so we treat the outcome as though it were the cause. It is almost never the cause. A new situation does not install a new interior, and if the old reactions are still running, they will go on running in the new place, using much better material. There is a body of psychological research on what is called self-efficacy, which is a person's belief in their own capacity to carry out an action. The most robust finding in it is not flattering to encouragement. Confidence built out of praise turns out to be thin and easily collapsed. The durable kind comes almost entirely from what researchers call mastery experiences, which means the accumulated record of having attempted something difficult, having handled it imperfectly, and having continued anyway, which produces an uncomfortable conclusion. There is no route to durable readiness that does not pass through a period of difficulty producing no visible reward. It cannot be given to us by someone who believes in us, and it cannot be reasoned into place. Jung put it in much harder language. He wrote that a man who has not passed through the inferno of his passions has never overcome them. He is not recommending suffering, and he is not romanticizing it. He is stating a limit, which is that we do not master something by avoiding it, and we do not become steady around a thing by never having been near it. Whatever we have not gone through still has authority over us, no matter how accurately we have learned to describe it. Picture a diver breathing compressed air at depth. Under pressure, nitrogen dissolves into the tissues of the body, quietly and continuously, over the whole time spent below, and it causes no problem while the diver stays down there. The danger appears on the way up. If the ascent is fast, The dissolved gas comes out of solution too quickly and forms bubbles in the blood and the joints. It can cripple or kill somebody who was fine 4 minutes earlier. Divers therefore stop on the way up. They hang at fixed depths for fixed periods, doing nothing and seeing nothing, waiting in open water while the body releases at a survivable rate what the depth has put into it. The stops are not a delay in the ascent. The stops are the only thing that makes the ascent survivable. If you have been through a long period of pressure, and most of us watching this have, then something was dissolved into you during it. A permanent low-level fear about money. A conviction that good things are always followed by a bill. A reflex that reads stability as the moment just before bad news arrives. None of that surfaces while we remain at depth, because at depth, it is simply the water we are in. All of it surfaces on the way up. It surfaces when the offer comes, when the person stays, when the year is finally a good one, and something in us starts scanning the sky out of habit. The years of stopping were not life refusing to lift you. They were the interval during which the pressure was coming out of you at a rate you were able to survive. Elif, the translator, said something about this that has stayed with me since. When the first novel finally came, she did not feel triumphant. She felt calm, and slightly disappointed by her own calm, as though she had expected the moment to repay 9 years of Sunday evenings. What she noticed much later was that she had negotiated her rate without apologizing for it. She had handed back a chapter she was not satisfied with and told the editor she needed 2 more weeks. The 34-year-old would not have done a single one of those things. She would have taken the first offer, submitted work she knew was weak, and delivered it on time out of pure terror. The 9 years did not buy her the novel. The 9 years bought her the version of herself that did not damage the novel. So sit with the real question now and be specific about it instead of general. Take the thing you most want and place it into your life on an ordinary Tuesday. Who would you have to be on that Tuesday in order to hold it without shrinking it? Which reaction would need to have loosened by then? What conversation would you need to be able to have without your voice changing halfway through? This is not a question about whether you deserve it, because your worth is not conditional on your readiness, and nobody is examined at the door. It is a question about capacity, which is an entirely different thing, and capacity can be built, and there will come a day when the thing appears and does not knock you sideways. It will not be because it is smaller than you hoped for, and it will not be because you have stopped caring about it. It will be because you have become someone with enough interior room to receive it as an event inside your life, rather than as a verdict on your life. That is what the door has been waiting for all this time, not your patience, and not your suffering, and not enough years served to satisfy something that was keeping count. Only the room. Look back now across the whole stretch, from wherever it started to wherever you happen to be sitting tonight. You are not going to find that every year was purposeful, and I am not going to tell you that you will. Some of it was fear, and some of it was the wrong door held open far too long. Some of it was simply time passing, while we did the best we could with what we understood at the time. That is what every person alive is doing at every moment, including the ones who appear to be ahead of you, but you are also not going to find nothing there. Somewhere in that stretch, you stopped needing every effort to produce an immediate result. Somewhere in it, you learned to tell the difference between wanting something and needing to be seen wanting it. Somewhere in it, you built the half-second between the feeling and the decision that you did not have before, and you built it without noticing, during a period you have spent years calling wasted. Jung believed that real transformation almost never arrives through a single dramatic event. It arrives when a person becomes able to look at the same unchanged situation through a different quality of consciousness, and discovers that the situation is no longer able to determine them in the way that it once did. The thing you have been waiting for may still not have arrived, and it may arrive next year, or in a different shape, or not at all, and I will not pretend otherwise. But whether it comes or whether it does not. Those years did not leave you where they found you. That part has already happened, and it is not conditional on anything that has yet to occur. If this reached you tonight, please like the video and subscribe to the channel so that we can keep looking at the inner world through the lens of Carl Jung. And when the counting starts again, as it will, remember what the last decade was actually doing while you were busy grieving it. You were not being left behind while other people were quietly let through. You were being made into the person who could walk through and still be standing on the other side. You didn't wait this long for nothing. You waited this long because the thing you were waiting for required somebody you had not yet finished becoming.